So I think the main challenge, the first challenge you'll see is every Indian government will come in with a neighborhood first policy. You look, for example, 2004, when the first UPA government came in under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the foreign minister at that point, Natwar Singh, said the exact same phrase that we heard from Prime Minister Modi. Neighborhood first. He actually comes to Nepal first, I think in May, June 2004. And there's always this initial focus on the neighborhood, and then a slow sort of regression and a loss of focus. So you have every Indian government saying, we will come first, and we will look at the map first, and we'll look at the region first, but then getting distracted with other priorities, whether it's the US, China, Russia, and you have sort of India losing attention, losing focus. So that's going to be a very important challenge, and I think we're seeing this already in the neighborhood. You saw Prime Minister Modi coming here to Kathmandu early on, and a fantastic visit, a rare good visit, first visit I think in over 2 decades of a prime minister, and then this loss of attention and sort of other channels, other groups in the Indian government taking over the relation and leading to the crisis last year. A second challenge I see often in Indian foreign policy, and I think Nepal faces this often, is a shift from what is a very interesting principle coined by the former Minister of External Affairs, Natwar Singh, in the 1980s, called the right of first refusal. And that shift, I'll explain in a second what that means. This old principle of right of first refusal is very strongly rooted still in the Indian bureaucracy and needs to shift to what I call a capacity of first delivery. And this is a very, very difficult transition for the Indian government to do. The right of first refusal is based on a closed economy of up to the 1980s. So the link between economics and security is very strong. Until the 1980s, the perception was that any smaller neighboring country in the area who wanted to, for example, get support for a new energy grid in the Terai, like Nepal wanted in their late 80s, who wanted some military assistance, needed to come to Delhi first, submit its proposal to India, get it vetted by New Delhi, and New Delhi would sit on it and decide, we were going to give you this, whether it's an electrical grid, whether it's going to be a fighter jet or a tank or a water project, and then we will decide what is best for you, or given your demands, what we can give, or we will clear it and you can go somewhere else and we'll tell you where you can get it from. But the perception was that if you had foreign powers in the region, in South Asia, this would lead to problems for Indian security interests. And I'll give you one example. India and Nepal have an open border. Any presence in the Terai, for example, by a foreign power, for example, Chinese engineers, Chinese companies, was seen as a threat by India. Of course, when India and China had a war in '62, they were de facto enemy states. In many ways, you could argue still today they're competitors. So that was seen by the Indian establishment as a problem. Similarly, a second reason is, if one power comes into Nepal, another power will also start coming in. So that was the perception that during the Cold War, and this applies even today in a certain way, if you laid in too many powers, there'll be conflict, and if there's conflict in that country, for example Nepal, it will spill over into India across the open border. And at one point you have King Birendra asking, for example, the Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1987 for a certain military assistance. 6 months later, King Birendra meets again Rajiv Gandhi. And he asks him, where have you seen my file? Are you giving this to us? And Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi actually says, I can't find it. My bureaucracy has lost it. Now, we know this is an excuse because it was just sitting on it and couldn't provide this assistance. What does King Birendra do? He goes to China. And he does this why? Not necessarily because he needs the Chinese weapons, because he wants attention from India. So that's a classic strategy by every state that you will go. Now, the problem is today, you actually have alternatives. We live in an open economy, interdependent economy. Infrastructure is being built across the Himalayas into Nepal from China. The Americans have strong presence here. The British have a strong presence here. The French have a strong presence here. So you cannot expect anymore that you have the monopoly of assistance, and you cannot expect Nepal to wait for assistance. So this leads me to another point, which is privileged connectivity over security. So I don't know if you know this old King Mahendra phrase, but in the 1960s, when the Indians were very concerned that the road was being built from China into Nepal, he said communism won't arrive in a taxi cab. Right? You don't have to be afraid that by having a road, you will have communists coming in. Similarly, if you have a road between India and Myanmar, which is being discussed, you have the old security establishment saying we shouldn't have this because the Naga separatists in Northeast India will connect with Myanmar and this will lead to trouble. This is the old thinking. I think the new thinking, in the words of the former Foreign Secretary Shams Saran, who was an ambassador here, is that you need to transform India's border regions from buffer zones, this old British colonial thinking that separate you from the neighbors, into linking connectivity areas, which will link India to Nepal, to Myanmar, to China, to Bangladesh, to Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean region. So that will be, I think, a mindset change, which Foreign Secretary Shamsaran classified as such, because, in Xavier's words, India must start looking at national boundaries not as impenetrable walls which somehow protect us from the outside world, but as connectors bringing India closer to its neighbors. Another issue, challenge, is inter-organizational coordination. I think often in Kathmandu and in neighboring countries, the idea is that there's a single India out there which has a very clear policy and knows exactly what it wants, has its interests right. The Indians think similarly about China, that there's only one China policy towards India, that there's one single room in Beijing where this whole India policy is being designated, even in an authoritarian country like China. And there's nothing further from the truth, particularly in a democratic, complex country like India, where you have several agencies, several organizations fighting each other with different policies. And I'll give you one example. During 2005-06, when you had the Jan Anulan II here, Indian policy, was marked by tremendous differences. You had, on one side, the Ministry of External Affairs and Research and Analysis Wing, the External Intelligence Agency, which were pushing for change here and saying the king has become an obstacle for the democratization, decentralization, and stability of Nepal. And you had a different group, I'm simplifying this, which was the Domestic Intelligence, the Intelligence Bureau of India, the Prime Minister's office in many ways also, but on the fence, and the old guard, the conservative Indians who are pro-Hindutva, pro-king, who saw the king and the monarchy as a symbol of reputation here, who were pushing for good relations with the king and the survival of monarchy, and against the Maoists. Now, we know who won, the first group, obviously, but it's interesting that this was years and years of debates between 2002 and 2005-06, till April 2006, so 22, 23, 24 April of 2006, you still have Karan Singh as a special envoy coming here, presenting the first line, even while the second line had already prevailed, while the agreement had been signed in 2005. So that needs to be improved in Delhi. I think there's also a big problem in India, you'll see, of how to explain what India is doing in the neighborhood. This is less relevant for Nepal, but it's important because you'll see that in an open country like India, and Nepal has a similar issue, so this will be familiar to you. With a free press, a vibrant press, it's very difficult to explain why you are doing something. And it's particularly difficult for India, for the reasons I mentioned in my introduction to this talk, to explain, for the Indian government to explain to the public that it is playing a role in Nepal. Right? The default policy by an Indian Ministry of External Affairs bureaucrat is, we have no role in Nepal, we will work with any type of government in Kathmandu. Now, this is not true from the 50 years of history I've looked at. India has preferences, like every state has its preferences. Sometimes it chooses inaction, doesn't do anything, but is accused of action. Sometimes it chooses full-fledged intervention, for example, in Sri Lanka, when it sent its military to impose the peace settlement between the Tamils and the Sri Lankan government. So it's very difficult often to have a sane, good debate between Nepal and India, because the Indian side will often just refuse any type of involvement and an interest in saying, we prefer actually to work with the Maoists in 2006 because we believe that the Maoists will reform. Now, no one said this. You had the current President Pranab Mukherjee, as late as 2008-09, for the first time saying, we are responsible for the peace agreement of 2005, or we at least played a role which is important, and we are proud of that we facilitated Nepal's peaceful transition to a republic and in the 10 years of a violent civil war, which is an amazing feat, right, which your country has achieved. It's very important for India to understand that another challenge is to take the long view. Oftenly you have India very interested in toppling a certain government, in playing with one faction or the other, in getting on a micromanaged level sort of involved in the neighboring countries. So you have this temptation to get over-involved and playing politics and choosing persons to, whether as ministers or as heads of certain agencies or as head of the army. I think that sounds familiar to you if you look at 2008-09. So there is often that temptation. That is a very dangerous issue because you are wasting a lot of attention, capital in getting the person you want for the right job, but you're not taking the long view and establishing confidence, trust, in developing good relation at the bilateral level. So I think the temptation for India will be to take the long view. What is in its interest in the long view? In gaining capital, gaining support, gaining constituencies, for example, in Nepal, in the long view, instead of just micromanaging small government. So if you remember in the 1990s, there was the Gujral Doctrine, named after an external affairs minister of India, who said that we need to provide benefits to our neighbors without having a transactional approach. Meaning basically we have to give privileged benefits to our neighbors on trade, on transit, on commerce, on investments, on mobility, on migration, because that will create stakeholders for better bilateral relations in this neighboring country in the future. Another challenge is, the converse one, is improving signaling and red lines. But what I mean by that is often in India you'll say, if I may say so, you off the record, so the Prime Minister of India calling your Prime Minister and saying on the constitutional and the Madhya issue, bring them in, work with the Madhyasis, bring them in, but not saying how to bring them in or what India actually expects as a solution to a constitutional issue, nor also saying, if you don't, this will happen. This will be the repercussion. So what happens is that often the message in Kathmandu and Colombo is not understood. What is the security interest of India? What is the problem? And suddenly, when you have the neighboring country going ahead and doing something, you have New Delhi going into alarm mode, going ballistic, supporting or not opposing, if you want, a blockade, and taking a very strong stance on things, which catches the neighboring country by surprise. So India will have to play a much smarter game at signaling what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. What would we like? What is of our concern? I think a big challenge for India will be to understand that manners matter, protocol, how you behave with neighboring countries is very important. So instead of giving high protocol visibility to the US visiting officials, the most important countries to be respected are actually the neighboring countries. You didn't have a prime ministerial visit of India to Nepal and Sri Lanka in more than 20 years. That is simply not acceptable if you are really true about a neighborhood first policy. Another issue is to engage or not to engage. I think often India has a dilemma between working with government or working against governments. And it's a short-term interest against a long-term interest. So for example, in the short term, the king in Nepal was always very good because he would deliver. In the short term, it was an interest to work with him. It was a clear single point of contact for India to work here in Kathmandu. But in the long term, it was clear that absolute monarchy by the 1980s was not feasible for this country. That there were grievances, whether in democratic parties, whether in the left, which led to the Maoist insurgency, that this was not sustainable. So often India is caught between, let's work with this dictator or with this single person, individual, or this party because they can deliver, but for how long? Because the country will change. The challenge for India will be not to neglect the Chinese role in South Asia, but also not to overreact. It's a very thin line and very difficult. I think the big problem in Delhi I hear these days is that India has a big problem in terms of delivering projects. Their public sector undertakings are weak. They're not able to even develop the northeast of India. They're unable to bring development to many parts of their own country. They have huge challenges in operating in third countries. You see that in India, Myanmar. There's projects which have been going for the last 15 to 20 years, which have still not been completed. You see India and Bangladesh, having hardly any railway link, one railway link, maybe second now, and these are countries which are very close. It is easier today to transport a container from Delhi to Singapore than from Delhi to Dhaka. There's huge problems in connectivity and delivering on connectivity from the Indian side. I'll finish with I think, the larger idea that India will have to really change its neighborhood policy to start delivering. Just to say you are changing it is not enough. The countries around India are expecting action, are expecting deliverables. So it'll be very interesting to see also what Nepal wants from India and where the priority areas should be. And I look forward to listening also to your opinions of where those priority sectors lie. Thank you for your attention.